say cheese. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pete Blom. I am the chairman of the Libertarian Party of Okaloosa County. I would like to thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see you all tonight. And on behalf of the Libertarian Party Okaloosa County, I'd like to thank you for coming to this fundraiser high above the city of Destin in the wonderful Emerald Grand. It should be a night to remember. Okaloosa County is a great place to live. It has wonderful people, beautiful forests, tranquil beaches, and it doesn't seem to lack for anything except one thing. When it comes to local government, it lacks competition. Americans in general, and libertarians in particular, believe in competition. The greatest amount of happiness and prosperity comes from people being able to compete in a free market where their individual rights are preserved by a government that is limited in its power. This is what leads to lasting benefits for both individuals and society. Most people would agree, but for the last 150 years, from Okaloosa County all the way to the Congress, our leaders can come from only the Republican or Democrat parties. In a group of 4 Americans, you will find 5 different opinions, but somehow when election time comes along, we all just fall in line behind 2 major parties. As ridiculous as it seems, every solution, every possibility, every good comes from either column R or column D and nowhere else. That, of course, is false. The legacy of decades of Republican and Democrat rule is that real competition has been eliminated. Our markets are managed for the ultimate benefit of a few. There are no effective limits to what government can do. Our individual rights and privacy get traded away by legislatures for temporary and questionable assurances of security. The Republicans and Democrats have been doing this dance with each other for so long, they don't want anyone else to join it. Our current economic debacle is the result of this attitude towards the libertarian approach. Just look at the attempted remedies. Artificially low interest rates, a form of price fixing, discourages individual savings just when savings are what households need. The Congress, the Secretary, and the Treasury, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve prop up failing banks and brain-dead companies when these zombie institutions should be buried so new firms can take their place. The federal, state, and local governments borrow trillions when the money is desperately needed in the private sector in order to correct bubble-era capital investment mistakes. And they shackle future generations to trillions in debt when the next generation will have a hard enough time coping with its own problems. Furthermore, it is taken for granted that government can and should use the tax system to achieve social goals instead of people doing so by free association, making decisions on their own. It is taken for granted that government can and should take the lead in planning and running the economy instead of people voting with their wallets. It is taken for granted that government can and should do anything that it sets its fickle mind to. The Republicans and Democrats have forgotten that the business of government is not to own business or to grant favors. It is to protect individual rights. Libertarians know America can do better. America is built on libertarian values. No one thinks about their future and says, I look forward to the day the government confiscates my property, gives me what they see fit for it, tells me how to use it, taxes me on everything I buy and sell, manages the market I go to, changes the financial rules to suit themselves when they feel like it, give privileges to my business competitors, gives my money to failing businesses, devalues my currency, gives me permission to travel, searches where they like, tells me how I can speak on political matters, monitors my personal finances, tells me what I can do with my body, and forces me to give financial support and health care. But incredibly, that is where we are. Every solution, every good, every possibility does not come from government, but from individuals who put the time, sweat, caring, and personal risk into a project in order to make it better. Libertarians are about making it possible to do for yourself and to allow others to do for themselves as much as possible. At the same time, we must maintain legitimate and limited roles of government, such as defense, a justice system, and maintaining our republic according to the Constitution. What then does the Libertarian Party of Okaloosa County want to do? Simply, we want to build a sustainable party that can speak for those in the county who believe in individual rights, free markets, and limited government. We want to grow. We invite you to take part in these exciting times and help shape this party. Your generous contributions will allow the Libertarian Party of Okaloosa County to incorporate, advertise, engage, grow, and organize those actively involved in issues such as public corruption, beach erosion, the Mid-Bay Bridge, where to cut in county government, the county's relationship with the state bureaucracy, eminent domain, county housing, mortgages and real estate, permits, zoning, and much, much more. We will organize efforts to make it easy for people to register as libertarians. We will increase contacts with local groups that share libertarian values and understand the personal benefits of living without the crutch of government. And most of all, we will find and support libertarian candidates who can implement this vision. Yes, that sounds like a lot, but with your help, we can do it. Tell your friends and neighbors about us. Let us know about those people that you think are leaders, and we will contact them. It will be one of the best things you can do for your own freedom and prosperity, as well as that of your friends and neighbors. Remember, the best parts of America are libertarian. Please visit our website, libertarianpoc.org. That's libertarianpoc.org, to keep up with events in Okaloosa County. You can also use it to comment and tell us what matters to you. Before I introduce tonight's guest speaker, I would like to thank the assistance of Ben Juergens, our Vice Chairman, Jeff Bullard, our Treasurer, Steve Kopis, our Secretary, for their dedication and for helping arrange this event. I would also like to thank Libertarians Lee Jackson, Clyde Hartz, Tony Moore, and Mike Mayer for their outstanding support over the last year. And lastly, I would like to thank my son, Matt, who was your elevator operator. Please allow me to change gears a little bit now and talk about the highlight of the evening. The economy. It's on everyone's mind, and it's especially on the mind of our guest speaker, Mr. Carl Denninger. I first noticed the name Carl Denninger while surfing the financial web pages a few years back. I soon realized that he was being quoted in a wide range of places, sometimes without mentioning his name. A resident of sunny Niceville, Florida, as he says on his YouTube videos. Carl Denninger is the former CEO of MCSNet, a major regional internet company in the 1990s that served the greater Chicago area. Today he writes The Market Ticker, a daily internet publication focused on the economy and capital markets. He received the 2009 Reed Irvine Accuracy in Media Award for his coverage of the 2008-2009 financial meltdown. Increasingly well-known and widely respected, he is a YouTube market commentator, CNBC television guest, and contributor to 321 Gold, The Burning Platform, DollarCollapse.com, GuruRockwell.com, and probably a dozen other websites that I haven't found yet. Please welcome Mr. Carl Denninger.
Good evening. If I get out of sync here, please let me know. I cannot see the screen, so my little clicker, hopefully everything will stay where it's supposed to. I want to talk tonight about the economy, how we ended up where we are now, and what we can do to make things better in the future. It's necessary that we spend some time on what has happened to get us here, because without an understanding of the past, we cannot correct those errors and go forward into the future. I'd like to start by saying the first thing that you need to do here is question absolutely everything. That includes me. You need to understand that the foundation of economic theory, as you've heard it recited, is fundamentally wrong. If you have an incorrect thesis, every decision you make and all of the conclusions conclusions you draw from that point forward will also be wrong. If it doesn't make any sense when somebody tells you something, whether it's CNBC, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, or anybody else, you're being bamboozled. The easiest way to put this is, if you look around the room and you can't figure out who the sucker is, it's you. We take a look at what is called neoclassical economics. This is the basic economic equation that is taught in every college and high school class across the country, from literally the high school economics class up to PhD level. We have this basic equation called MV equals PQ. You've probably seen that quoted if you've paid any attention to people talking about economics over time. And that is basically that money supply times velocity equals price. That is the price of all the goods and services that are produced in the economy times the quantity. You say, well, that's easy. The amount of money, the speed with which it circulates, the number of times you and I hand money back and forth to each other, must equal the price of all the goods and services in the economy times the quantity of those goods and services, the number of televisions, chairs, bottles of beer, whatever have you. The problem is M isn't the money supply. That's what you've been told, that's what's taught in colleges across this country, and it's wrong. When you look at the reality, money and credit are fungible. That means they're interchangeable without limit. Everyone in this room knows that. How many have a credit card in your wallet right now? Everyone? Okay. How many of you have some dollar bills in your wallet right now? Go into any store, go across the street to McGuire's. Pull your credit card out, pull your money out, put them on the table. Will they both buy you a beer for the exact same amount? Well, gee, that's a funny thing, isn't it? So, the issue isn't money, it's credit. This is the error that's made and has been made for the last 200 years in America and 2,000 years preceding America in the study of so-called classical economics. And once you make that mistake, everything else that you do with your economic theory is incorrect. Credit is the quantity. That's because in all modern economic systems, money is in fact debt. When the Federal Reserve prints up Federal Reserve notes and puts them into circulation, they give them to the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department in exchange gives them Treasury bonds. When the Treasury wants to sell debt into the economy, it can sell it to the Federal Reserve, it can sell it to somebody else, it can sell it to the Saudis. They're willing to exchange bonds for oil. But in fact, every dollar in your wallet is essentially a bond, because it is linked back to the productive ability of the United States, everybody that lives and works within this country, and ultimately, the service on that debt comes from your willingness to get off your butt and go to work, because guess what you got to pay to do that? That would be, anybody? Taxes! That's how the government gets its money. It siphons off a piece of the economic activity. And that is true in every nation on the planet. So what is interest? Interest is very simple. That's the price of borrowing someone else's capital. The price of that borrowing is set by three things. The expectation of inflation, that is, the money that you get back will not buy as much as the money that you have today. The risk that you won't get paid at all. The person's not going to be able to cover the debt. And everyone in an economic system acts for one thing and one thing only, and that is for profit. So every time that you borrow capital from somebody, they're going to charge you a rate of interest based upon those three factors. And profit is never zero. So let's look at the basics of risk in the lending equation. The more debt that you have for a given amount of income, a given amount of productive capacity, the higher the level of risk is that you're not going to be able to pay. That's obvious, isn't it? If you have $50,000 worth of income, you have $10,000 in credit card debt, you have a certain level of risk. If you all of a sudden go out and charge up another $10,000, it is more likely that you're not going to be able to pay that second $10,000 off, and therefore, a prudent person is going to charge you more as your interest as your debt level rises. And the more uncertain your income is, the higher the risk that you're not going to be able to pay. Now, for governments, this is very important because when they get too big, people say, oh, gee, why do I want to go to work? I think I'll just sit around, collect welfare, and drink beer all day long. Well, that makes their income a little uncertain too, doesn't it? So as taxes go up, people try to shift their productive output into a form that doesn't generate taxable liability, whether it be sitting on the couch, or whether they just decide not to work so hard. And finally, unsecured lending. That is, when you go to the bar across the street here and you buy a beer on your Visa card, drink it, that's an unsecured lending transaction because the beer is used and you just rented it. There isn't anything to go collect if you don't pay back the money that was used to buy that beer. That's different from buying a car or a house or some other piece of tangible property that has value, in that there is some security on that transaction. So unsecured lending is very risky because in the event that you don't pay, there is no collateral, there's nothing to go take. All right, so let's talk about the Federal Reserve. It's not what you hear on Tout TV. That's what I call CNBC and Bloomberg and all these other guys. How many people here have heard the Federal Reserve say, or heard somebody say on TV, the Federal Reserve sets interest rates? Everybody in the room, right? We've all heard that. That's a lie. The Federal Reserve is governed by a law called the Federal Reserve Act, originally of 1913, now 12 U.S.C. 225A. The mandate is the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Open Market Committee shall maintain long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. Where did you hear in that set interest rates? You didn't, because it's missing. That's not what the Fed does. The market leads. The Federal Reserve follows. The Fed can influence the market through the control of liquidity, that is excess money flying around in the economy that nobody has a particular use for right now. Money is just like anything else. If I've got a case of beer up here, and there's 5 people that want one, the price is pretty low. But if I've got 5 gallons of water and there was just a hurricane and there's 500 people that want it, that water's going to be pretty expensive. Money's no different than anything else. But how well has the Federal Reserve discharged this responsibility? And notice, in that mandate, specifically says their job is to manage credit aggregates. You think somebody knows that it's not money supply we're talking about? Yeah, maybe. Well, here's the chart. Here's the ugly truth. What happened starting roughly in 1980? That's about the midpoint in that graph. The bottom of that chart is the growth in gross domestic product. The top part of that chart is the growth in debt or credit in all areas of the economy. And guess who publishes this information? That would be the Federal Reserve themselves. I didn't have to go make this up. They actually put this out every 3 months in a data release called the Z1. All of the credit aggregates separated into categories are produced, and of course GDP is produced by our Bureau of Economic Analysis. We'll get to that later. They cook the numbers a little bit, but we'll use theirs because we really don't have to get real ones to see just how ugly this is. So you say, well, the government spends so much dang money. It's all the government's fault. Well, maybe not. That little purple slice in there, that's all that the government's responsible for. All the rest of the colors in that chart are not the government. So exactly where is the major problem here? Well, if we look from 1980 onward, you can see that it's actually gotten quite a bit worse since the 1980s. And that's where the real problems come from. The right-hand scale, by the way, the gray shading, is the debt to GDP ratio. That is, how much debt exists in the economy for every dollar of gross domestic product that is out there. The current total of all debt in the system is about $53 trillion. And by the way, that's understated because our government runs books in a funny way that if you or I tried to do that in business, we'd all end up in prison for 20 years. They don't count things like the promises they made to everybody in this room to pay Social Security and Medicare benefits. They just kind of ignore the fact that that's there. They get away with this because under the law, Social Security and Medicare is a tax. So they don't actually owe you anything. And they didn't bother to tell you that when you signed up for your W-4 and gave it to your employer. All right, so what was the motive in doing all of this? Well, it's pretty simple. Since 1980, there's been about $228 trillion worth of economic output in the United States. That's everything. All the beer, all the cars, this building. $53 trillion has been taken on in debt. That's the total outstanding. That's about twice the long-term sustainable amount. So what that means is we've taken $25 trillion and spent it pulling forward demand. When you go into a car dealer and you buy a car using credit, you are buying a car today to have today that you can't afford to pay cash for. Well, that's a car that you're not going to need tomorrow because you already have it. So what we've done is time shift demand in the economy. We haven't actually increased it. All we've done is change when it happens, not whether it happens. The bad news, of course, is that everybody that loans money wants interest. So you have to pay more than what you would have had to cover if you just forked it up in cash. So for 10%, roughly, of additional GDP, when you see the GDP numbers come out, they say the economy grew at 2.3% last quarter. Well, it's 0.23% less than that is what it would have been if we hadn't played this game. That's all we've gotten out of this over the last 20 years. For that, we've destroyed our long-term economic stability. 10%, folks. The reality is this, it's the math. Two exponential functions where one is greater than the other will always run away from each other. The graph that's on the screen shows the bottom curve, GDP growth of 5% a year. Each of the curves above that is a growth in debt of 2% higher. So the first one's 7, the next one's 9, 11, 13. You can see what happens over the space of 20 years. Now, it's obvious that you're not going to be able to pay at some point in the future. We're not arguing over whether or not we will go broke. We're arguing over when we will go broke. Because you cannot grow credit aggregates faster than you grow the economy on a permanent basis. You can do it for a while, but you can't do it forever. And the reality is this, the Fed's actions, top to bottom, are fraud. We've spent 20 years of decreasing ability to cover the debt in the economy. We also double count things in gross domestic product, which are pretty ugly as well. An example of that is, if I've got a car that's sold in this country, and it has a fuel injection system in it, and I made that here in the United States, and I ship that production over to China, we count the value of that fuel injection system when it's sold as GDP, even though half of it happened over there. Well, that's not right. But that's how the government does things because they don't adjust that back out. So we actually haven't grown the economy as fast as we claim we have, which means the numbers are worse than they appear. The problem is that when you increase the debt to GDP, think about it, folks, and just like you take out more debt for your income, what's this do to the interest rate? Interest rate should go which way? Up, right? Well, except If we did that, the government couldn't pay. So we have a distortion here that says that interest rates must go down so the government can make its debt payments. But the risk of not paying has gone up, so the market rate would rise. So who's been tampering with the game? Well, take a guess. That would be our friends that Bernanke controls. The reality of this is we're all Madoff. We've been playing Ponzi scheme for 20 years, folks. This is my Ponzi finance indicator that's on the screen right now. This is a very simple chart. It is the difference annualized in growth between debt and GDP. When that number is negative, you are destroying your ability to sustain the economy over the long term. When it's positive, you are improving the ability to sustain the economy over the long term. And over the last 20 years, we've had 1 year when that number has been positive. 1 year. And that's it. By the way, it wasn't all that much better from 1953 on, which is as far back as the data that I can get goes. But it's gotten much worse. So where we are here is we're on a road to financial hell. And now we're starting to get a little bit of it, getting a little warm in here. When we repealed Glass-Steagall, the last pieces of it were torn down in the late 1990s. We made sovereign credit, that is the full faith and credit of the United States government, available for financial speculation. That was not possible from the time of the Depression forward until then. The banks love this. They benefit from it when times are good. But the problem is that they've used some of this money to bribe government officials. And of course, bribing government officials is as old as government. That's nothing new. In the 1700s, after this nation was founded, the bankers from Britain actually sent chests of gold over here to bribe congressmen and senators to try to get rid of silver as a bimetallic standard. Why? Well, because we had some silver in the United States, and we didn't have much in the way of gold, and if they had control over the monetary supply, they could win the Second Revolution without actually having to have another revolution. See, they didn't like the fact that we kicked the British out. So, that's nothing new, but the misallocation of credit, folks, that we have had over the last 20 years is exactly the same disease that we suffered in the 1920s. There are three kinds of lending that can go on in the economy. Positive impacts are had from what is called productive lending. That happens when I borrow money to buy something like a CNC machine or a cold molding device or some other piece of equipment that makes something. Because what I have done in that situation is I have bought the means of production today by borrowing capital. And that device or that thing produces much more than the value of the interest that I have to pay in order to finance its purchase. There is also neutral lending or consumptive lending, which takes place when you use your ability to get credit to buy, for example, an automobile. Not for business purposes, but just because you want it. Or a house to live in, not to run a business from. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but it doesn't actually add anything. All you're doing is shifting in time when demand takes place. That's neutral on balance to the economy. And then there's Ponzi lending, and that takes place when you purchase financial instruments that have an element of speculation in them, i.e. credit default swaps, anyone? Stocks, bonds. Any time that you speculate using borrowed money, you are essentially doing it for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is that there is another sucker somewhere who will pay you more for it than what you pay. Well, what we've done here with the financial bubble is allegedly transfer risk. So we took a bunch of loans and we put them all into this pile, and then we sold them to people. Well, the people that bought them gave us cash, and then we could make some more loans. We didn't have to wait until people paid off the original loans because we had our money back right away. Little problem with that, isn't there? There's only so many things that you can buy and do something productive with, yes? There's only so many people in the room, there's only so many people in the country. Well, the guys that did this weren't entirely entirely stupid, so they bought these things called credit default swaps from somebody that allegedly transferred the risk that you would pay a mortgage to someone else. So the guy who had this piece of a mortgage in a mortgage-backed security, he didn't actually have to take the risk, because if you didn't pay, this guy over here would cover it. Problem is that this securitized debt has huge losses that aren't reflected in the price. You see, unlike a mortgage where you pay your principal and interest every month, a bond doesn't work that way. You get your interest payment every month, every quarter, every year, but the face value of the bond isn't due until it matures. So if you default on paying your mortgage, as long as there's enough money somewhere in the pipeline to cover the interest payments, the guy that holds the bond over here doesn't know, unless he tries to sell the bond, in which case the person who's going to buy it takes a look at all the loans that are contained within it and says, hey, wait a minute, this guy over here isn't paying, this guy over here isn't paying, this guy over here. Well, that's not worth all of the money that it says it's going to be worth. There's a discount. The credit default swap problem is even worse. They were written by people that had no money at all. So, when you get down to it, credit default swaps, one great big fraud. This is kind of like, you have a house, and I buy a fire insurance policy on your house. Pete over here buys one too, and this guy over here buys one, and now there's 10 people that have fire insurance policies on your house. And then you look out your window at 9 o'clock one evening, and we're all running around with gas cans and lighters, and you're trying to figure out, why is it that there's a bunch of guys walking around outside of my house at 9 o'clock at night carrying gasoline cans? Well, because it's to my advantage if your house burns down, you see. I get paid even though I don't own the house. So what have we done here? We've done two things that are fraudulent. First off, these people wrote so-called insurance, even though they don't call it insurance, because that would trigger legal requirements. And they had no money to pay. But on top of that, you created a huge incentive for people to commit financial arson. Because there's all these people that can collect, and all they got to do is make your business burn to the ground. Well, that's a problem. So, again, why do you do all this silly stuff? Well, it's simple. Money. Leverage is great. Borrowing money and using it to speculate is fantastic. When things go your way, you make a whole bunch of money with very little capital. If I can borrow $1,000, but I only have $10, and that $1,000 investment becomes worth $2,000, I made $1,000, but I only put $10 on the table. Well, the profit on that is huge as a percentage of the original capital that I had. Well, what everybody seems to forget is that what goes up can come down, and if I'm levered up the same sort of way, very small losses wipe me out. This, by the way, is why Lehman Brothers, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, AIG, and Bear Stearns all went kaboom. Because every one of them, for every dollar that they actually had anywhere between $30 and $200 of risk out. If you have $200 of risk out for every dollar of capital you possess, if you lose 50 cents on a $100 transaction, you're bankrupt. So why did anybody pull this, knowing these facts? And listen, these guys are not stupid. Well, it's very simple. Since 1987, the presumption has been, if you're a big bank or other financial institution, the government will bail you out. The taxpayer will be forced to eat the loss. That has become a policy. Unfortunately, mathematics wins, even when you try to play Ponzi mathematics with the taxpayer's wallet. So what have we done here? Well, since this whole thing started to go kablooey in 2007, we have big banks, they can borrow at zero, right? Fed funds rate 0%, 0 to a quarter. How come everybody seems to be getting these letters from Citibank that says their interest rate on their credit cards is now 29.9? Well, that would be because everyone seems to be losing their job, they have too much debt, and the bank has determined that the risk of loaning you money is very high, so they're going to jack up the interest rate. Oh, wait a minute. to the bank just as high? Well, it would seem so, no. But instead of allowing the banks to pay a market rate, which by the way would force them out of business, and then we'd end up with new banks, and all those people that had stocks and bonds and the old ones, they go broke too. Instead of doing that, we made you pay for it. Because that's what the government can do. They can stick a gun up your nose and say, fork over more of your earnings, and if that's not good enough, they'll just make sure your kids pay for it. The mortgage market is even worse. The Federal Reserve has a restriction on the purchase of securities. They're not allowed to take credit risk, that is, the risk that you can't pay. And as a result, under the law, they're only allowed to buy things that are guaranteed by the federal government. Well, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are not government-guaranteed enterprises, no matter what you've heard on television. They file quarterly reports every 3 months, and on the very first page, it says right there, we do not carry any guarantee from any agency of the government, and our debt and our securities and the things that we do are only obligations of us. And by the way, the reason the government doesn't want to take on that responsibility is there's $5 trillion worth of trash sitting on those two companies' balance sheets, and it isn't worth $5 trillion. So they would take an immediate loss, probably of $1 trillion more, if they were to go ahead and take that risk. So as a result, we're playing this little game here where we supposedly drive down interest rates for people getting loans to buy houses. But the risk of buying a house is going up because unemployment is high. So you ought to be paying more, not less. The result of all of this is that the bad debt that's out there in the system has not been flushed out. The reality is that we build places like this, we build houses all over the place, then we pass the hot potato around and see who the bigger sucker is, bidding the price of all of these things up, whether they be houses, stocks, or whatever have you. Okay, that's fine, except all of this is backed by debt, and at the end of the day, some of that debt's bad. People can't pay. Instead of actually recognizing these losses, we instead have shuffled most of this off onto the government. That's a pretty idea, except that it, so far, last year, was $1.4 trillion worth of extra debt that the government has taken on to cover this up for 1 year. And the worst part of it is, they didn't even get rid of the bad debt doing it. That's just to pay the interest, so that nobody recognizes that this stuff has gone kabang. It gets better. President Obama was going to get this under control, right? This is what we were all told. Hope and change. This was what we were sold. John McCain was going to do it too, remember? You know, straight talk express. Okay? How come $300 billion more has been added onto the national debt in the last 2 months? The federal government closes its books in September. October, November, $300 billion. Well, let me see. Let's see if I can do this math here. That would be $1.8 trillion if it continues at this rate through the rest of this coming year. But I thought the economy was getting better. Didn't we hear that things are getting better? We can fix this, folks. We have to stop trying to prop up housing prices so the market clears. The reality is this: with a reasonable mortgage, you can afford about 3 times the value in a house, whatever your income is. That's been true for the last 200 years, and it will be true for the next 200. In places like California, values got as high as 10 times incomes on average. Around here, it wasn't a whole lot better than that. The problem is nobody can qualify under reasonable documentation standards, so we have banks that did this. Hi, Mr. Jones, you'd like to buy a house. How big a house would you like to buy? I'd like to buy a house. You cost $500,000. Okay. How much money do you make? I make $200 grand a year. Oh, okay, here, sign right here. Here's your mortgage. Mr. Jones hands out cards at Walmart. Of course, he can't pay. So the banks, to get around that little inconvenient problem, gave him a loan where he'd only have to pay a tiny fraction of what was actually due for the first couple of years. The whole concept behind this is that if the price went up, the bank didn't have any risk, because if you couldn't pay, they'd just seize your house, throw you in the street. But they'd be okay because they could sell it to some other sucker. Well, that didn't work out so well when the price of houses started going down. And all of a sudden, you can't pay, they throw you out, and that $500,000 house is only worth $300 grand. Well, now they eat $200,000. So, they have a solution for that too. They just won't evict you. There are people I know right here in this area today that haven't made a mortgage payment in a year and a half. They're still living in the house. There are people in California that I know that haven't made a mortgage payment in 2 years, and they're still living in the house. How? Well, because the bank just lies. If we don't foreclose, we don't have to recognize the house is only worth half what you paid for it. Clever trick, huh? Everyone says if we do these things, it's going to cause a depression. Folks, we're already in one. Let's face the facts. Unemployment during the 1930s got to about 25% at the worst. We say it's 10 right now, right? That's what you hear on the radio, that's what they say on the television. Wrong. U6, which is all people officially unemployed, plus all people who are part-time that want full-time jobs, plus discouraged workers, is 17% of the workforce. Okay? But that's not everybody. If you gave up and didn't look for work, you don't count. There's another number called not in the labor force. We have to add all those people in too. The real number is about 1 in 5. And among certain subsegments of the population, for example, 18 to 24-year-old black youths, it's over 60%. These are people who would love to get up and go to work in the morning. There is no work. So the idea that we're going to somehow solve this problem by papering it over is false. We have to get the excess credit that is debt out of the system. There is no other way to restore economic balance and prosperity over the long term. All the gimmicks that they try to run, and boy, if they run a lot of them, are just going to produce a short-term blip somewhere and more pain later. We tried this in 2000, folks. I ran an internet company in the 1990s. All those companies, how many of you lost money in the stock market in 2000 when it crashed? All right. I looked at the S1s, which is they call it the red herring. It's basically a tout sheet for all the new companies that come public. I saw hundreds of them during the 1990s. They claimed the global output of all domestic product across the entire globe some 100 times over. Now, obviously, 99 out of 100 of those companies are going to go bankrupt, right? I mean, you can't possibly claim the entire output of the world 100 times over and be telling the truth. But that's what they did. It was a scam. And when it blew up, we blew a bigger bubble. Well, what was a bigger bubble?
Real estate.
Real estate. So now, everybody's house value supposedly goes up. But it didn't really go up. Did your house get any more valuable sitting there? No, it got less valuable. It needs a new roof. You have to paint it. You got to replace the carpeting. You got to keep putting money into it or it turns into dust over time, right? But no matter what you do, unless you add onto it, if it's got 3 bedrooms, it still sleeps the same number of people. Its value hasn't risen a bit. Whether you can find another sucker that will give you more money for it is a different question entirely. But its actual value to you as shelter has not changed. We've lost our way on this, folks. We also have to enforce the law. There are a body of laws out there right now that prohibit all of what has gone on. The banks that are operating right now that are insolvent, that have hidden losses, that is illegal. The FDIC, under the law, a body of law called Prompt Corrective Action, contains dozens of shalls that have to do with marking those assets at the current value, forcing losses to be recognized, and closing depository institutions, that is banks, before they run out of money. Sheila Bair and her friends in Washington have willfully and intentionally ignored that law for the last 2.5 years. Why? Because when I go into a bank and I put a gun in the teller's nose and I say, give me all your money, there's an or else. It says, thou shalt not rob banks, or else you go to jail for 20 years. Well, this law says, thou shalt not allow banks to lose all of their capital twice, or you get promoted. There's no or else in any of these laws. There are laws that govern supposed predatory lending. There are laws that govern the Federal Reserve's actions. All of these bodies of laws. Nowhere does it say, do this or go to jail. We have plenty of regulations, folks, who would have stopped all of this. Credit default swaps. They're illegal. Not just to sell, okay? They say, yeah, we couldn't have stopped AIG from selling. Well, it's true. There's no law that says AIG couldn't sell insurance with no money. But there is a body of law that says Goldman Sachs can't buy them and count them as assets if the person on the other side doesn't have any cash to pay. They bought a worthless piece of paper, not an asset. But nowhere in the law is a do the accounting right as a regulator, as a bank regulator, or go to prison. IndyMac Bank. How many of you remember who they are? You ever heard of them? Big bank out west. They did a lot of mortgages around here too. They actually backdated deposits to cheat their examinations. The person in the government agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, that allowed them to get away with this, did the same thing during the S&L crisis with a different institution. He kept his job. That bank cost the FDIC something on the order of $18 billion when they failed. They should have cost them zero. The problem isn't that we don't have the right laws, folks. The problem is we refuse to enforce them. I think I ended up somewhere in the wrong place here. Yeah, I'm in the wrong place. All right. There we go. All right. What is a depression? A depression is quite simply credit contraction. Remember, folks, M in the classical economic equation isn't money, it's credit. When credit is contracting, it's the same thing as taking money out of the monetary system. That's where depression comes from. When you reach the limit of being able to expand the credit supply, you get a depression. I don't care whether you want one or not. That's what happens. What's going on here? Mortgages are going down in outstanding balances. Consumer credit is going down. Why? Because people can't afford to borrow any more money. It's not very hard to figure out. But the problem here is that we say, oh, it's the government's fault. Oh, no, it's not. That arrow on that chart, the top piece, I rearranged that chart a little bit from before. The top piece is the government. Notice that if you look at the whole chart, it's still growing, right? It's still getting bigger all the way over to the right-hand side. Now take that top piece out. Notice how it's curling over. If you leave the federal government out of it, that's all the other credit in the system. Everything. Financial, government, business, everything except federal government. Take it out. Every other area of credit is contracting right now and has been since the beginning of 2008. Consumer credit, just got the update on it yesterday, still going down. That nice blue line is credit cards, outstanding. That's outstanding credit card debt of all people in the United States. Why? Well, I don't know, 29.9% interest is usually a pretty good reason not to run up your credit cards, right? The other number is non-revolving credit. That's auto loans and things like that. That's actually leveled off. Guess why? Because the federal government did the wonderful job of getting you to take all of your junky cars that were fully paid off and had no debt and throw them in the trash and take out another loan to buy another car. Oh, wait a minute, that's backwards. I thought if you didn't have a whole lot of money, you'd probably be better off buying and driving a car that doesn't have a car payment, right? Well, the government says, oh, no, we can't allow that to happen. So that's all cash for clunkers. Everyone says the consumer's okay You probably heard about Black Friday. They said Black Friday wasn't all that bad, right? It was kind of all right. Sales were up a little bit. Oh, really? This morning. This is real data, folks, off the scanners in checkout lines. This isn't some government guess. This is the price of things sold. This is 2008 to 2009 change. LCD TVs down 22%. Notebook computers down 26%. Camcorders down 33%. Point-and-shoot cameras down 7%. GPS devices down 14%. And stereo headphones, why in the devil they included that, I don't know, down 19%. That's the price of products bought on average on Black Friday. Now, computers get cheaper over time, right? But all that means is you get more computer for the same amount of money. What this says, people don't have it. I look at some of the other numbers. ShopperTrack's data was out. They're notoriously optimistic. They're even now saying, oops, we got a little problem. And by the way, everyone here lives in this area. You tell me, you've been driving around this town for the last 2 weeks. Where are the people? Don't count feet, count bags. Go to the commons. Walk around there, see how many people have bags in their hands. Friday night, Black Friday night, my daughter and I were over there watching a movie. You could have shot a howitzer down the middle of that street and not hit anybody. So when somebody tries to tell me that everything's okay in the retail world and with people and shopping and everything else, yeah, okay, pull the other one, guys. All right, how do we get out of this? A house is a place to hang your hat. It's not a speculative financial instrument. We need to change the concept in this country as to what a home is. It's a place to live, it is a place to raise a family, it is a place to sleep, cook, whatever have you. It is not something to be flipped as a speculative tool. We have to get rid of all of the off-balance sheet gains and other financial cookery, every bit of it. And there's a lot. We have to put or else into all of the laws. We don't need new laws. The ones that we have are perfectly fine. They're not being enforced. If they were, we wouldn't be in this mess. And if we'd gotten into it and they started enforcing the laws, we'd have a few thousand people in prison right now and we'd be out of it. And those who speculate have to be exposed at all times to all of the risks they take on, which means no more government backstops for anybody. You want to gamble, you can gamble. But what you can't do is gamble with someone else's money. We've put Glass-Steagall back in. The government had it right in 1933. I can't believe FDR. Everybody said he was a buffoon, right? Well, he was in many ways. But one thing he did do correctly, one thing that our Congress did correctly, and let's be honest, the president signs laws, he doesn't make them. Glass-Steagall separated investment banks and commercial banks. It prohibited banks from speculating in the financial markets with deposits. It prohibited them from being involved in anything other than plain vanilla lending. They were utilities, much like the power company. And we didn't have a serious economic dislocation or depression for more than 50 years. How? We've had 2 serious dislocations in the last 10 years. The reason was simple. With Glass-Steagall in place, most lending went into productive investment. Not all of it, but most of it. It was favored over speculation. You can't tinker with this. You cannot do this by imposing leverage limits or other kinds of gains. You have to get these institutions that fundamentally have the ability to trade on the credit of the United States federal government out of the financial markets. There is no other way to fix this. By the way, Paul Volcker has been saying this now since before Obama was elected. You notice how you don't see him at any of Obama's press conferences anymore? He gave a speech yesterday where he, again, said this very same thing. It wasn't covered by the American media. Why? Well, probably because all the Congress people are in these guys' pockets. If you want to speculate, you have to be able to do it only with your own capital, nobody else's. Sound banking is really not hard. Every dollar of lending that you do as a bank that is unsecured has to be backed by a dollar of excess capital. That's actual money that one of your investors has put up. And all assets have to be held at the market price, so that if you have to sell them, you can sell them now to someone. If you do this, the reserve ratios provide that no depositor will ever lose a dime. Ever. It is mathematically impossible for depositors to lose money. The FDIC doesn't need to exist. We should keep it only because we have government officials that get bribed from time to time and they don't enforce the law. So the way you solve that is you have that there. And then you go string up the government officials that did the cheating when they have to pay out. Here's the reality, folks. You cannot spend more than you make forever. Everyone in this room knows that. I mean, come on. This is no different for a country than it is for a person. We cannot live on serial asset bubbles. Every time we do it, and every time there is a crash, we remove some of the margin between the amount of money that's available to service debt and the amount of debt that's in the economy. When you get to the limit, you get a disaster, and that's what we're in right now. We learned this in the 1930s, but we forgot it. And guess what? The reason's simple. Everyone's dead. We had Glass-Steagall before. That was the answer. It prevents this from happening again. It makes Ponzi credit expansion impossible. That's the reason it makes sense. By the way, I generally hate government intervention in anything. Okay? Just so you know, I'm not one of these guys that will tell you the government's the answer to everything. Is usually the answer to nothing. But when you are dealing with the credit of a government, the ability of a government to borrow money, and whether you like it or not, folks, that's in the Constitution. Okay? In Article 1, it's right there. Congress has the authority to borrow money on the credit of the United States. There is, by the way, if you read the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, there was quite a debate over whether or not that one sentence ought to be in there. But at the end of the day, it was put in there. So we have to live with it, at least for the time being. As long as that capability exists, you need regulation of that ability so it does not filter out into private actors who can then obligate the government to cover their butts. And that's the problem that we've run into. We need to correct the monetary record. The monetary base, that's what Bernanke talks about all the time. Oh, we doubled the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. We've doubled the monetary. No, he hasn't. The monetary base isn't any of that garbage. The monetary base is the unencumbered assets in the economy against which people are both willing and able to borrow. Everyone in this room knows this. You have a Visa card in your pocket. It has a credit limit. As long as you're willing to use it, and as long as there is credit remaining on it, you can spend. If either of those two things is not true, you cannot spend. This isn't very hard to figure out. How come nobody talks about this? Because then you have to deal with the problem that is presented by credit growth. As soon as you recognize where money comes from and how it works in a modern economy, you have to recognize that you cannot grow credit faster than you grow productive output. If you do, you eventually will go broke. We don't want to talk about that. But that is what we need to do. And of course, when you cheat the math, you get what we got. All right. Now the part that all the libertarians are going to hate. Libertarian philosophy tends to gravitate towards hard money, gold-backed currency in particular. Hard money solves nothing. The problem has always been credit expansion. It's never been the amount of money in the economy. There's a famous quote that says, "Give me control of a nation's money supply and I care not who makes its laws." It's clever. Problem is, it's not money supply, it's credit supply. You don't really expect these guys that are trying to take control of the world to actually tell the truth, do you? That would be a bridge too far. We had tulip mania in Holland. We had 5 depressions in the United States through the history of this country up to the 1930s, not including the one we're in now. All of them occurred while this nation was on a monetary standard that was based on gold. Every one, except for the current one, of course. Hard money creates a problem. It is actually easier for the people who control that supply to cause depressions and economic contraction anytime they want. This is why the central bankers love it. Consider this. If we were to go to a gold standard, we produce almost no gold within this country at all. None. Essentially all of it comes from South Africa and China. We want to grow our economy, say 3%. We therefore must increase the supply of credit money in the system to remain in balance by that same 3%. Correct? All right? What if China won't sell us any gold? What happens? You get an instant depression because you cause deflation, which causes the value of all debts in the system in terms of productive output to go up. And the people who control that supply can do that anytime they want. And throughout history, they have. It's very tempting to try to look at a gold standard as an answer to these problems, but unfortunately it is not. Wait a minute, am I in the wrong place here? Oh, there we go. Next one. There's a common theme going around. The Fed and the Treasury saved us from a depression. I heard it today on CNBC. And how many times did it come up during Bernanke's reconfirmation hearing? I can't count. All right, I watched the whole thing. I was going to throw up 4 or 5 times. Jim Bunning, by the way, is the only senator that I heard that actually had a brain in his head during that hearing. And I pulled his testimony out and stuck it up in a YouTube video. You all ought to go read it and watch it, listen to it. He isn't a very good speaker. You might just want to read it. But he grilled the guy and essentially nailed him with all of the things that I've talked about tonight. If we had gotten the bad debt out of the system, we would have been safe from a depression. Unfortunately, Citibank would be gone, Bank of America would be gone, Goldman Sachs would probably be gone, Morgan Stanley, they'd all be gone. Why? Because they loaned a bunch of people money, $500,000 to buy houses when they were $250,000, and they don't have it. Well, instead, we've shifted that debt and hidden it. But the consequences of the bad lending are still there. They've just been suspended for a little while. They will come back. They say the economy is improving. Well, if the economy is improving, why is credit continuing to contract? Why are rail shipments down on an annualized basis? Why is all of the GDP improvement that we've seen for the last 2 quarters government borrowing and spending? Cash, and it's not just cash for clunkers, but cash for clunkers is the most obvious. I go down a list of programs, I can actually find all of the GDP improvement that's happened in the 2nd and 3rd quarters, and every last bit of it was not caused by private activity in the economy. It was caused by the government borrowing $1.5 trillion and blowing it. Well, that's a great idea, except the government has to pay it back. So this is just like losing your job and going out and charging up your credit card. It feels really good until the bill shows up. Government borrowing saves the day. Can you drink yourself sober? Let's face the facts. we can fix this, but we have to change our economy back to what it was. You have to be producing something. You either must mine, manufacture, or grow something in order to produce wealth. Financial speculation doesn't create wealth. It subtracts wealth. This ought to be obvious to anybody who thinks about it for more than about 30 seconds. If I make a loan to you here in the room, I get to keep all of the interest that's paid. But if I have our friend over here, the banker, get involved in this transaction, he siphons some of that interest off because nobody works for free. There's no free lunch, folks. You can't take the transaction, the amount of money that's available in a transaction, and make it larger by passing it through more hands. You make it smaller because everybody that touches it wants a piece of it for themselves. I've yet to see anyone that will pay you in order to handle your financial matters. It's always the other way around. Papering over losses doesn't work. We did this in 2000, we just made a bigger mess. The reality is this. If we had forced all those people who couldn't make their mortgage payments out, foreclosed on them all in 2007, we would have a cleared housing market right now. And the number of institutions that need to go under would be about half of what it is today. The bottom line is, if you've ever traded stocks, bonds, options, anything, the first loss is not only the best loss, it's also the smallest one. And finally, both major political parties have this deadline. I don't care if it's Democrat or Republican. Now, one of them has the first clue how to fix this, because they will not fire the people on Wall Street and on K Street that butter their bread. And if you think that the people in government don't know everything that I've talked about tonight, if you think Ben Bernanke doesn't know about the inherent unsustainability of trying to grow credit faster than gross domestic output, the man has a PhD in economics. He knows. The Senate knows. The House knows. President Obama knows. The bottom line is this. It's more important that they manage to loot as much as possible, just like it was in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we didn't get out of the Depression until there was a war. We had many false starts, but we never actually got back to building things until World War II. Let's hope we don't have to go there again. And if you're interested in what goes on a daily basis, the market ticker is where I chronicle all of this stuff. I recommend a good stiff drink before you sit down to read it every evening. And if you have young children, you might want to make sure they're in bed so they don't hear the four-letter words coming out of your mouth. There's usually plenty of it to go around. In Ticker Forum, for those of you that have a little bit thicker skin, is where we have a bunch of traders and other people that are involved in the markets on a daily basis, myself included. The language there can get a little rough, but that's where we have a fairly open discussion on exactly what's going on. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll take any questions that you might have. Feel free to take as many cheap shots as you want.
Are you bearish on the long term? What the U.S. dollar is going to be?
The easiest way I can describe my outlook for the currency is that we are deeply screwed in this country. The rest of the world is screwed worse. When you're standing in a room of hookers, the one that has crabs looks pretty good when the rest have AIDS. And that's a horrible way to put it, but it's really not far from the truth, okay? We have a screwed up banking system in this country with a lot of problems. We have a screwed up asset base in this country that is dramatically overvalued. But you only think our leverage and our accounting practices are bad until you go outside the United States and look at what's going on over in Europe in particular, or look at what's going on in China. China, for example, counts gross domestic product when something is manufactured, not when it's sold. Well, gee, let's see. So we'll build 5 million cars, and they will sit in lots, and we will count that as GDP. Even though nobody's ever driven, they've never driven a mile. There are entire cities in China that have nobody in them. Are we in trouble? Yeah. Where does everyone go when all of this collapses? They go to the lever that has the fewest spots. Right now, and over the last 6 to 9 months, we've seen, and if you've been watching the dollar at all, you've seen that it's fallen in value by about 18%. That's due to the carry trade. People are borrowing dollars, essentially becoming short the dollar, and then buying assets that have a higher yield, for example, government bonds in Australia. The gimmick with this is because they're sovereign bonds, they have supposedly zero risk. So then they turn around and they use those as collateral and borrow more dollars. This is the old leverage game. Let's turn it around 10 times, and instead of making 3%, we'll make 30. That works until the dollar goes up in value against the Australian dollar, and all of a sudden, instead of losing 1%, they lose 5 or 10. That trade used to be primarily with the yen, because the Japanese had a zero interest rate for years after their deflationary collapse back in the 1990s. A big part of the crash we had last year, everyone says it was Lehman Brothers. Okay, at AIG, that's what caused it. That's wrong. The majority of the collapse that we underwent last year in the financial markets was due to the unwind of the yen carry trade. The bad news is the dollar carry trade, when it unwinds, is going to be at least as bad as it was last year, maybe worse, but the dollar is going to rocket higher when that happens. By the way, if you own gold, it's going to get smashed in dollars. Of course, you'll still own the same amount of gold, right? I mean, if you have 10 ounces of gold or 100 ounces of stone, 100 ounces of gold. But priced in dollars, it will get smashed. There were a lot of people that thought that it was immediately going to go to $3,000 or $5,000 an ounce. The last 3 days, it's lost $100 in value. That is because of fears of default over in Dubai and Greece. That, in turn, caused people to run into the dollar and started to squeeze the carry trade. That little blip you saw in the gold price and in the dollar appreciation was due to a fear of the unwind. But it didn't actually happen. It's one of the things I watch very carefully, because when it occurs, it's going to be extraordinarily ugly. And it's one of Bernanke's greatest failings. He could put a stop to it right now by taking enough liquidity out of the system to drive the Fed funds rate up to about 2%. That would still be extremely accommodative by any standard of history, okay? But it would make the carry trade unprofitable. And, you know, he tries to claim there is no such thing. Well, you know, look, I look at the flows in the foreign exchange markets, and my best guess is there's about $500 billion on that right now. So, and it's getting bigger by the day. Yeah.
Do you think that they'll raise rates before November next year? FOMC?
I think there's a major problem that they have, which is that they currently, when they get done buying their mortgage-backed securities, which are illegal for them to purchase, they have a mark-to-market loss on those securities right now. They're being made good by the Treasury, which has thrown $100 billion into Fannie and Freddie between the two of them over the last 9 months or thereabouts. Treasury is authorized under the bill that was passed last year, 2008, to put $200 billion into them in aggregate between the two. They are going to run out of money before they run out of credit problems. Okay? The current delinquency rate in that portfolio is running about 6%, and that's 60 days plus. Essentially, no mortgage that's more than 60 days past due cures, because you'd have to make 3 payments all at once in order to do it. That basically never happens. Okay, I mean, if it's $2,000 payment, you have to make $6,000 payment. Where are you going to get $6 grand? Okay, that's not going to happen. Historically, once a mortgage goes more than one payment past due, it's done. If the recovery rates on those notes end up being about where they are now, there is about $500 billion worth of losses today in those portfolios. They've recognized a fifth of it. Well, how's Bernanke going to unwind that? If he pulls liquidity and rates go up across the board and things get very bad for financing for everyone, I don't know how he gets out of this. He says he's got an exit plan. Frankly, I look at the math and I don't see how he can. Okay. The problem there is that I think he gets forced at some point, and it probably detonates the Federal Reserve, which might be the best thing that could ever happen to this country, is throw those funds out and have the actual government issue debt-free currency into the economy, basically spend it into existence as opposed to borrow it into existence. It was very similar to what Lincoln did with greenbacks, okay? But use that to fund government spending, control circulation that way. The problem with that, as I have also noted in several of the ticker articles, is that you really want Barney Frank and Chris Dodd controlling the money supply of the United States. I mean, Ben Bernanke's bad, okay, but I'm not sure that Chris Dodd and Barney Frank are not worse. So, I mean, we're dealing with devils here no matter how we slice this. I just don't know how he gets out of this trap. He's built himself a big hole, and he keeps digging, and at the bottom there's a bomb, and it's got a timer on it. If he can't get out of the hole before it goes off, he blows himself up. I just don't see how he does it mathematically. So, anybody else? Yeah?
What kind of skeletons in the closet do you think are going to be if the audit of the Fed bill gets passed?
They better pass that. And by the way, that so far, just for everybody that doesn't know, that has at this point been attached to the financial reform bill. That is going to be reported onto the floor within the next 2 weeks. So it's not the standalone bill that Ron Paul was championing. It was attached in the Financial Services Committee about a week and a half ago and passed as an attachment to the financial reform bill.
He's already said he's going to be forced to vote against his own bill.
No, actually that was before that was when they tried to water it down. Waters tried to take a whole bunch of stuff out of it. That amendment failed. Has he said this recently, like in the last couple of days?
Yeah, like a day ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what's going on in the committee because Rules has it now. The bill is in Rules at the moment, and Rules controls what goes in and what comes out at the end of the day onto the floor. I'm in contact with a couple of representatives, including Alan Grayson, who's one of the people who's been behind this. I don't know, I haven't kept track of what Ron Paul said recently, but I have been tracking that particular bill and the amendments that have been attached to it. And Paul's amendment, unmolested, is in that bill. So if he's going to vote against his own amendment at this point, I'd really like to know why, seeing as the language he wrote without being changed is there. So why would you vote against what you asked for? He's got what he wants as long as it doesn't get changed before it ends up on the floor. It could have, who knows what Rules is going to do to it, okay? I have no idea. But I am watching it very carefully because that's really the last change point before it ends up on the floor of the House. I think it's going to pass. I think the Senate is a bigger problem. There are several senators who have said that they're not going to allow that to go through. What do I think we're going to find? Several things. I think we're going to find that a couple $100 billion was funneled out of the American taxpayer's pocket without being appropriated to foreign banks, particularly Deutsche Bank, SocGen, Credit Suisse. I think we're going to find that Bernanke has intentionally tampered with the mortgage securities market, including essentially falsifying the balance sheet of every bank in this country as a consequence of doing so. That second one, by the way, if anyone pays attention to the law, is a crime. I think we are going to find that he has intentionally ignored his mandate, as I pointed out in one of the first slides, to manage credit aggregates. I think the record is going to show that that was an intentional or wanton act, which means the Federal Reserve is in violation of its charter. And I also believe that it will demonstrate that all of the maiden lane LLCs that have been set up through the New York Fed were done illegally, and that there's absolutely no legal justification for any of that stuff that they've done during this crisis. But what the consequences of all of that are, I can't predict. I mean, I know what ought to happen. They ought to repeal the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and throw them all out. Do I think it's likely? Probably not from Congress. I think the more likely outcome, if they detonate, is it's going to be because of the inability to unwind what they're doing. And ultimately, the bond market will take care of this. Greece is essentially screwed at this point. Okay, they've taken on too much debt, they're not going to be able to service it, and ultimately they will default. We'll end up in that same box. It just may take a little while. And when he tries to unwind these securities that he's purchased, he's going to run into the problem that nobody's going to give him anywhere close to what he paid for. Yeah.
Okay, so since there's all this law breaking going on, and it's so obvious, and all these guys have PhDs, and you know, the handwriting's on the wall, it's very clear what must happen or what's going to happen. So what's the end game? What's the strategy? Are they deliberate? Is it a deliberate? Then it's a deliberate plan to bankrupt the country. And if that's the case, then to what end?
Well,
who's going to take? I mean, there's always a shift in wealth. I mean, there's always so much wealth. Who's going to gain? And it's obvious who the losers are going to be, the taxpayer.
We're standing
on the government as we know it. But what's going to come out? What are they hoping to achieve? When you know this is going to happen.
Let's take this as two separate questions. Okay, first off, was it a deliberate attempt to bankrupt the country? No, I don't believe it was. I believe that what you essentially have. I mean, let's take a look at Larry Summers. Okay, this is one example. That's Obama's head economic advisor. He was the guy that orchestrated the repeal of the last pieces of Glass-Steagall. He was the one that was responsible for that bill going through Congress and being signed into law. All right? He advocated heavily for it. He lobbied for it. He was in the government at the time it happened. That was his bill. He's not going to come out and say he screwed up. 20 years ago, he created a depression because he's an idiot. When was the last time you ever heard anyone in Washington, D.C. say, I made a mistake? All right? That has never happened in the history of this country. So the problem is that once you do something stupid like that, then you got to do more stupid things to cover up the effects of the first stupid thing that you did, because it's politically unacceptable to stand up and tell the truth. The last president we had in this country who told the truth, and I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, was Jimmy Carter. How many of you remember him getting in front of a television camera in a cardigan sweater? Any of you guys old enough to remember that? Do you know what he said during that speech? Do you remember that speech? I remember it very well. I was a kid, but I remember it. He said, we are currently growing our electricity consumption in this country, and our energy consumption, 7% a year. And at that rate, in 10 years, we will use more energy than has been used in the entire history of the planet. That happens to be an exact representation of that exponential graph that I put up on the screen earlier tonight. That was the truth. He was fired for saying that. Okay? So, tell the American people that they can't have Skittles out of the unicorn, and they send you packing. So once the first mistake's made, and let's face it, Greenspan, I mean, good God. You know, he's just into his 10-year 1987 stock market crashes, right? What does he do? He throws the monetary spigots open, he throws all kinds of liquidity in the system, he creates another bubble, which then blows up into long-term capital management. That explodes. He bails that out. We get the internet bubble. The NASDAQ stock market doubles in 9 months. Okay? It crashes. He's worried about deflation. So he cranks open the monetary spigots again, and what do we get this time? We get the housing bubble. And each one of those is about 10 times bigger than the one in front of it. We could have stopped anywhere along that line and taken the economic pain that had to happen. I don't believe these people did it to try to bankrupt the country. I think they did it because standing up and saying, I screwed up and made a mistake was unacceptable. So where does it go? Well, the bad debt will come out of the system. It did in the 1930s. It will happen again. All we're arguing over right now is how bad it's going to get before it happens. They're trying to blow another bubble now. Look at what's going on in the stock market, okay? The S&P 500, the current price-earnings ratio multiple on the S&P 500 is 83. It has never been there before. Never in the history of the market has it traded 83 times earnings. Never. But that's where it trades at today. The height of the NASDAQ bubble, the NASDAQ traded at 60 times earnings. Okay? So, what happened? Oh, it's obvious. They threw a bunch of free money around and where did it all go? Well, let's see, we can't pump up housing, we can't pump up let's see, let's bid up oil, let's bid up gold, let's bid up every financial asset you can think of. But there's no earnings behind any of that. Companies are reporting better earnings because they're firing people. But revenues are down. Well, that's a great idea for one quarter, but the problem is the guy you fire can't buy anything next month. All right? So what's going to happen to your earnings 6 months down the road? They're going to collapse. But this is all part and parcel of the same thing. Obama has gone out there, he's got his audacity of hope thing going on now. Now his newest thing is healthcare. I can tell you exactly what he's trying to do because it's the only thing that makes any logical sense. Okay? We spend 17% of our economy currently, our GDP, on healthcare right now. That's almost double what every other major industrialized country spends. We have a $14 trillion economy. We spend pretty close to $2.5 trillion a year in healthcare. I believe his intention is to destroy the private healthcare system and then cut it back to about 7% of GDP, which is roughly where Canada is. And he thinks that if he does this, he can get $1.5 trillion a year out of the credit system by doing that. Okay? If he doesn't get lynched first. The problem is he's going to raise everybody's taxes to pay for this, but he's not going to actually make any of the other changes until year 6, 7, 8 when he's about to leave office. And the whole game here is the same thing they play with Social Security, Medicare, everything else. Okay? We backload all the costs, we front load all the taxes. They tried to raise taxes. Look, it's the same thing they tried to do in the right after the 1929 stock market crash. All right? They tried to raise taxes as a way to get out of the mess because the government was blowing all this money that it didn't have. And all they did was collapse the economy 4 years later. We actually had 2 depressions in the 1930s. The second one was in 36 and 37. And it was caused because the government attempted to borrow its way out. They couldn't do it. So they tried to tax their way out. All right? And the result was they crashed the economy a second time. I mean, it wasn't bad enough that we collapsed it once. We had to do it twice because we were just too dumb to figure it out the first time. That's essentially the path the government's on right now, is to try to find a way to get taxes up without you realizing that they're going way up. But that's what's going to happen. It's inevitable. I don't think these guys have any other clue as to how to handle this. But the only logical thing that makes any sense with trying to put this healthcare bill through is exactly that. Now, you're not going to hear that from anybody in the government, but I guarantee you that's exactly what they're trying to do, because it's the only way that they can make it work from a numbers perspective. And they will never admit that. But you watch. 10 years from now, we're going to have a Canadian system. For all of its goods or bads, that's what we're going to know, whether we like it or not. Yeah?
Is the coming commercial real estate problem going to be the same as residential housing?
It's worse. And here's why. When you buy a house, you typically make principal and interest payments and you end up owning a house. Okay? 30 years, 30 mortgage, even if you take some exotic thing, the idea is eventually you end up owning a house, right? I mean, that's the concept of it. I can count on the fingers of one hand the commercial real estate developments have done that way. Virtually every commercial real estate deal that has ever been done in the history of this country, and especially in the last 20 years, has been interest only, with the cash flow from the rents coming in from the leasing of the space sufficient to cover the interest payments. Principal's not paid down at all. What that means is the loan has to be rolled over when it matures. Okay? Now we did this by the way is how the 1920s, when we had the roaring 20s and we had a property boom in the 20s, which by the way was exactly what caused the blow up. Same thing as we did this time. All right? They didn't have computers back then, so they didn't have all these exotic mortgages. What they did was interest-only balloon notes. Basically, every commercial mortgage in the country is written the same way. It's an interest-only balloon. And the problem that you run into is this. They don't want to foreclose because the property is not worth what they loaned. Okay? And that would make the bank go under. And by the way, those deficiencies are not small. Colonial National, which just got taken out a couple of months ago, the mark on their lending portfolio for commercial real estate, the actual realized value on that when they sold it off was 60% below what they were carrying out on their books. They lost $6 for every 10 that they claimed they had in assets. There was only $4 really there. That's how bad this situation is. They don't want to foreclose on these properties because if they do, they have to recognize that loss. They pretend that the property's still worth, say, $100 million, when it's really only worth 40. All right? The problem, though, is the property across the street forecloses. You got, let's say you have two strip malls. This one over here was $1 million. This one forecloses and is only $500,000. Okay? When the guy buys it out of the foreclosure sale. All right. They're both full of tenants. The rent necessary to make the payment on this mortgage is twice as much as the rent necessary to make the payment on this mortgage, right? All right. So now, businesses get in trouble, and the guys over here, they're getting squeezed, and one of the businesses over here fails. Well, what happens? One of the businesses over here immediately moves over here to the other side, right? Because the rent's half as much. Well, after a couple of years, this guy doesn't have anybody in his building. All right. Now what's he paying a mortgage with? So, it's a ticking bomb that ultimately is going to go off. And there isn't anything you can do to prevent it. They're hoping and praying that the property values will come back. But you cannot do that because if I am say I run a candy shop, every dollar I have to give to the landlord for rent is $1 I can't pay this woman over here to stand behind the counter and sell candy. You want to put people to work? You want rents low or do you want rents high? If you want people to have jobs, you want rents low. So the business owner has more cash flow to pay employees with. That means he can hire more people. If rents are high, the guy that owns the building does all right, but everybody else gets hosed. We have this entirely backwards. We're trying to protect the banks and the people who make these improved loans. And as a result, we're laying off hundreds of thousands of people every month. It's happening because we are not allowing prices to correct and the market to assert itself. So I think the commercial real estate, I've got a list of some commercial real estate deals that have debt coverage ratios against the leases right now of 0.5, which means for every dollar of mortgage payment due, they're only getting 50 cents in lease income. The really bad news is you got to pay property taxes too. All right, so these deals are all going to go bang, and most of them that were written over the last 3 or 4 years, the last 3 or 4 years before it all blew up, 05, 06, 07, the cap rates that they were written at are totally unreasonable. There's no possible way those things were sound. They were unsound loans. They never should have been made in the first place, and there's absolutely nothing that can be done to save them. So, I mean, it's not as big as the residential market, okay? The debt nation is probably $1.5 trillion worth of commercial real estate that blows up, maybe a little more, but the losses are going to be horrific. Right? I would be willing to bet that we're going to see $600–700 billion worth of loss in that area. Maybe as much as half the total outstanding has to be rolled over the next 3 or 4 years. It's going to be really bad, and it's going to start next year. So we're pretty much running out of rope on those. It's gonna get really ugly.